Okay, I think we're about ready to start here. Um, I'm Diane Dunlap with MCNC. I have my coworker with me, John Wharf, and today I'll be going over integrating Google user accounts with the Zscaler content filter. And this is done through SAML. Here's a list of what we'll be covering. We'll be having a discussion of SAML, the Google and Zscaler setup for AAA, those being authentication, authorization, and accounting. Briefly, how this could be integrated with Active Directory, and things to watch out for in using SAML with Google. So what is SAML? The definition from Wikipedia is that it's XML-based, open standard. You use it for authentication and authorization, and it involves two entities. The identity provider, in this case it would be Google, and the service provider. Okay, there are a number of service providers that can be involved in this. I'm not sure, some of you probably have gone to websites other than Google where the site has maybe asked you, do you want to log in with Google? It might be Dropbox, Facebook, DocuSign, Amazon, and so on. And if you choose yes, voila, you're magically logged into the other site. So has Google taken over Dropbox or bought Amazon? No. Chances are the interaction between Google and some of these other sites is through what they call SAML assertion tokens. And now we can use the same mechanism with Zscaler. So why would we want to have Zscaler tied to Google? Well, we have some sites where folks do not have Active Directory, so it makes doing authentication difficult. You can upload accounts to Zscaler's hosted database, but you'd also be having to do the same thing to Google. So you'd upload the same accounts to Google as you would to Zscaler, but if users change their passwords in one or the other, then everything gets out of sync, and they can't do their homework, the kids. The authentication piece is a little more efficient by tying the two together, the two services. So instead of having to log into Gmail and log into Zscaler, we'll see later how we can do authentication and a half instead of two authentications. Okay, in terms of disadvantages, I mentioned how with SAML, there is a login and a half. It's still not one login, but it's better than the two logins you'd typically be having to do with Active Directory or hosted database, because you typically would have to be doing a Google login and a Zscaler login. If the kids are on site, they would also be having to do a login to PCs or laptops if that was what they were using. So it could be as many as 3 logins. We'll also show how the SAML assertion cookies can be somewhat persistent, which can be a negative factor, but not something you couldn't overcome. So we're going to be talking about AAA in association with tying these two services together. Here, AAA is not the American Automobile Association, but Authentication, which is who you are, which is your Google username and password only, Authorization, which is what you can do, which would involve the user's membership in a Google custom department and or groups in Google, and accounting. That's primarily tied to Zscaler, and you would see what the user did in the Zscaler logs. Okay, conceptually, this is what the data flow would look like with SAML. Whether our user is inside the network or remote, they would have to go through Zscaler to get to the internet. And before they're allowed to go to the internet, Zscaler would check with Google. The user would have to authenticate with Google before being allowed through Zscaler. If you're thinking of moving to SAML, here are some things to think about, such as your current authentication scheme, user training, how to roll this out without aggravating the users, how to accept devices which cannot authenticate, say your Hive Manager, your controller, your access points, that kind of thing. If you are thinking of moving from hosted database to SAML, do you have the same accounts in your hosted database that you do in Google or in Active Directory that you do in Google? Are there websites that need to be excluded from authentication? If you're going to do authorization, do you have rules in Zscaler for these departments and groups that we're going to be adding? And of course, you'd want to test this before doing a widespread rollout. Okay, so these are things you'd need to think about if you're thinking about doing SAML. Okay, how would you know if your users are doing authentication or not? Well, this is just a screenshot from a user interface. I think it was the lab. And you can see where we have a column for authentication. Okay, and if you look in Zscaler under Administration, Location, and you see where there's a column populated with enabled, then you are doing authentication on site. If you have off-site users using pack files, you are doing authentication with them, whether or not it says this in the column. And it wouldn't say that in the column if they're off-site users, but they're still doing authentication. Okay? And what we're showing here is you can't mix authentication methods. There are 3 ways you can do authentication in Zscaler. So Active Directory would be one, hosted database another, SAML another, and I guess there'd be 4 methods if you counted off, okay? But conceptually, you can't do Active Directory at the middle school, SAML the elementary, and hosted for other or at the high school, okay? It has to be across the board. You either go with SAML, Active Directory, or whatever. If you decided to move from Active Directory or hosted to SAML, you could temporarily turn off authentication at a site during the process and then gradually bring up the sites. But it is an all or nothing as far as authentication method. Okay, so we talked about with SAML how you would need to authenticate with Google in order to get through Zscaler. Suppose you can't get to Google to authenticate because you can't get through Zscaler. You kind of get caught in this vicious circle. So this is showing how on-site one would need to sort of punch a hole in Zscaler to not authenticate Google traffic. So if it's a destination of accounts.google.com, gmail.com, you would exclude these. And in this, there are a number of ways you can do this. We just said under Administration, Advanced Settings, we said we're going to exclude gmail.com, accounts.google.com. You can create a custom list that has Google on it. Different ways you could do this, okay? And you can also, you should also, let me think this was, okay, the previous one, okay, this was SSL exclusions. You need to exclude it under policy from SSL filtering. And then this one is excluding those same things from authentication filtering. So we need to kind of grease the skids so they can go out and get to their Gmail, because we're relying on that authentication having happened in order to get through Zscaler. Okay, it kind of shows doing this by use of a custom category. And if we're using a pack file offsite, we also need to, in the pack file, exclude accounts.google.com and gmail.com from filtering, because again, if they're offsite, they need to make that connection. Otherwise, they will not be able to get through Zscaler. Okay. So since we're going to be doing some of this presentation live, I wanted to show our lab setup. And in our k12gaps.mcnc.org Google domain, we have an OU called Password Manager. We did a webinar earlier this summer on Password Manager open source, so we still have the accounts there, and that's what we're showing. Under that OU, there are more OUs logically splitting up our users. And your management console, your Google domain probably looks something like this. Again, conceptually, our first column are our actual users. Our second column are our OUs within Google. And then our third column are our kind of group emails. You know, if you're going to send email to all the students, all the teachers, or whatever, that is what our domain looks like in the lab. Okay. So how do we turn on SAML in Google? To start with, configuring SAML in Google will not have any negative effect on your user accounts. So you can do this at any time. It doesn't affect Zscaler. It doesn't bother anything. You can go through the exercise of turning it on in Google, and if you later decide to use it or not, having it on is okay. The screen captures here are mostly from the Zscaler documentation, but there are a few gotchas along the way. This was a learning experience for MCNC, Google, and Zscaler tech support because the documentation was kind of sparse. So we first choose, we go into the admin console, we choose apps, we choose SAML, and we're going to add a SAML app. Okay? And the next screen will probably show Zscaler in the list. And most of the UIs we've looked at, it does. If it doesn't, just choose Set Up My Own Custom App. Okay, and then on the next screen, when we've chosen Zscaler, you would need to save the first URL to Notepad and download the certificate. Okay, so two things you need to do here. And the first URL is LEA specific. You can see where ours ends in that YAB4YE. Yours would end in something else. And your certificate would be specific to your site. Okay? The next screen we go to, it will usually say Zscaler, and you can also upload a logo here. We did upload a logo in our testing, but it didn't do anything. I never could see where the logo was displayed anywhere. So it's an option. You don't have to upload a logo. I probably wouldn't bother, but maybe you can get it to display somewhere. I really couldn't. Okay, then we hit next. And these two URLs may have to be changed because you saw where it's Zscaler versus Zscaler ONE. Okay? So if it says login.zscaler.net, you need to change it to zscalerone.net. And these two links, or these things you need to fill in, will be common to every LEA. They will be the same. Okay? Then on our attribute mapping, if you do not see any attribute mappings, you will have to add one. So we just are showing here how you have to add new mapping. It would show display name in the first column. The second column would be basic information. The third column, there's a pull down that says primary email. Okay? And we hit finish here. And at this point, we turn on SAML for everyone. Doesn't hurt anything. So we just go ahead and do that. Okay, so we have SAML configured in Zscaler, or in Google. Now, depending on if at your site you currently are using authentication or not, you might take one path versus another. No matter what you're going to do, I would go ahead and make a backup in Zscaler. So under Administration, Backup and Restore, go ahead and get a snapshot of your Zscaler. So if things went horribly wrong, you could restore. Okay? If you have no authentication currently, you can go ahead and configure SAML. If you have authentication on, it's going to be a little more tricky because during the configuration process and changing to SAML, it kind of kills your Active Directory. But talk to us about it. We can see if we can figure out some way of doing it, you know, so that you don't bother your users at the time. Because we talked about how authentication, it's all or nothing. You're either on Active Directory or hosted or SAML. Okay, so we've created our backup. And we go in to configure SAML in Zscaler. We choose that option. And remember how we had to save a link when we were going through our Google configuration. This is where we use that link in the top left here. Okay, and that certificate that we downloaded is what gets uploaded here. Then in our login name attribute on the top right, this is where we put our email. And down at the bottom, we choose Enable SAML Auto Provisioning. And we'll talk about that a little later, what it actually does. We put the primary email down below. And then at the very bottom left, we put department. And over to the right, we put groups. We'll get to those a little bit later to explain what they do. Okay, but it's no harm in putting them in there now. Okay. We hit save, and in the top right, we hit activate on that little red cylindrical thing you always see in Zscaler. Okay, so we talked about how you could test this in a very limited fashion, especially if you're not doing any authentication on site or off site. This is our lab setup. And you can see how we have some sort of odd looking sublocations. You may or may not have sublocations, but in this case, we're saying our odd users, and this is configured to the firewall. If you get an odd address, if you have your last .tet ending in 13579, whatever, you're an odd user. We turned on authentication for our odd users, okay? And we can set up in a test environment a sublocation as small as a single IP address. If you wanted to set up a static IP address at your desk for testing, we could have ITS, if it's ITS managed, set up a static IP address mapping for that, and we'd call it Joe's PC or Susie's PC or whatever, and we could enable authentication in a very limited fashion. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and show how authentication would work when we're using SAML, okay? And here I have a pack file on my machine, and this is Firefox. Okay, we're not really going to get into pack files here, but so I'm going to go to Gmail, and you saw how we excluded Gmail, whether it's a pack file or on-site. And I'm going to log into Gmail at this point. Okay, I'm in Gmail, and now I want to go to a different website. You see how I'm being redirected to Zscaler. Okay, and you see where Zscaler is kind of thinking about it here.
Yeah, Diane, real quick, wanted to make sure folks know one of the reasons why we are being redirected to the Zscaler is because we are coming in through a pack file.
Yes.
If this was going in through GRE, they probably would not see that necessarily, correct?
Through GRE, they would still see it. Yeah,
okay.
They would. Yeah, it's going to be still an authentication and a half is what I call it. You saw how the first authentication was a full Google authentication, and then the second one was Zscaler. Now, we did test a little bit with Chromebooks on site, and with the Chromebooks, we only saw one authentication on site. So you could see a little difference depending on the browser, and I think that's what John means there. Okay, so that is an authentication and a half with a pack file on Firefox. Okay, so in terms of doing the testing with pack files could be an option. And this just shows how I would be blocked and go to the sites that that I shouldn't be going. I can't even remember if I'm blockingpoker.com. Yeah, I'm blockingpoker.com, so you can see how I can't go there. All right. So let's look at the logs in Zscaler. Okay. If we were to look at the logs in Zscaler, when our users are authenticating, and we choose under the Web Insights in Zscaler, and that's how we look at the logs. In the upper right corner, we choose department in the pull down. And when we do that, you can see that some of our users are just displaying default department, okay? This is a pack file user I think I was doing, and our pack file user tried to go to holytaco.com. They weren't allowed to visit there, but the department is showing default department, okay? And the reason why it's doing that is we do not have authorization on. So at this point, we don't have any departments or groups in Google that Zscaler can make decisions based on, okay? And this may be fine for you if you just got a classroom full of Chromebooks you're sending home or iPads or whatever. You just want a yay or nay from Zscaler on whether or not the student can go there. But if you were having to differentiate between high school students and elementary, or teachers and middle school, or maybe you even wanted to give honor roll students the ability to do games or the Minecraft club, that kind of thing, you would need to turn on authorization. And authorization is beyond who the user is. Authorization is what the user can do. Okay, so we have our spreadsheet from earlier where we were showing our lab setup. We still have our first 3 columns, which are standard Google things. But to add authorization, we need to add custom attributes. And there are 2 kinds of custom attributes we can do. One would be the department, and the other one is the groups, and that is plural, the Zscaler, well, the groups attribute, okay? The contents on these are free form. You can make them anything you want to, but they have to exist for Google to send this information to Zscaler and for Zscaler to make decisions based on it. So in our setup, if we want to add authorization, we need to add a schema called department and a field called department within Google. We will also want to add a schema called groups and a field called groups in Google. Now you can't do this through the standard management console. It just isn't supported at this point. So we had to open a ticket with Google on how to do it, and they responded and said the first link will show you how to add custom schema, and the second link is to where you can actually do this in your management console. So we added a custom schema and a custom field, both called department. They're multi-valued, who can access it, what kind of thing it is. And as you can see, this is pretty complex to have to add this through the web. Lots of curly brackets, quotes, ticks, and all that. And if they are not perfect, you will get an error code 400. Not that this has ever happened to me, but yes, you will get an error code 400. So assuming that this all works and you've gotten the placeholders basically in there, then you have to populate the placeholders. And this is an example of how you would populate the placeholders using the web. And you can see where we wanted to add a value to our department for our user, 40 Glock at K-12 gaps, department schema, field department, and we wanted to add the value student in there. And when we hit execute for this, we get a return code 200, which is good. This is what we wanted. So we can see for our user, 40 Glock at K-12 gaps, we were able to add the value student for department schema, field, department schema, field, department. Okay. But doing this through the GUI is pretty painful. It really wouldn't scale well if we had 1,000 users to add departments or groups to. So I started looking at GAM, or Google Apps Manager. I needed to learn how to use GAM. And when I Googled Google GAM YouTube, the very first hit was a video from John. And here we have a link to his video. It's about a 55-minute video, so we're not going to sit here and watch it, but suffice it to say that GAM is installed on my desktop. And I've been using it also on my MacBook. It works like a champ. Okay, so we're going to go through a little bit of GAM live here. Okay. Where we have it installed on our PC. And we're first going to say GAM info on our domain just to make sure that GAM is functioning. And it is. It goes out and talks to Google. And if we wanted to add schema using GAM instead of using that horrible web interface, this is how we do it. So we say GAM create schema department, field department type string multi-valued end field. So it looks a little bit cryptic, but it works. If we want to add a groups custom schema and a field within there, we can also do that with GAM. And if we want to look, I'm not going to do this because I've already got them in there, but if we want to look to see what we do have in GAM, I'm going to say GAM print schemas. Okay. And it found our schemas in here. You can see where we do have a department schema with a department field. We have a group schema with a group field. I added some crazy ones like a cat variety schema with a color field just so I could understand how it works. Okay. But that is GAM, and that would be how you would do this without using the web. Okay. Okay. So say you have existing users. You've created your placeholders, so to speak, with your department.department, your groups.groups. How would you add this to your users? Well, you can also do that using GAM. This shows examples of adding some departments for Jane, some departments for 50 Cent, some groups for our various users. You can add multiple ones in the same command and so on. If you just had a few test users, this would work fine. Okay. And you can see here if we do GAM info on our user, and we can go ahead and do GAM info on our user Big Cootie at k12gaps.mcnc.org. It will show his information, and Big Cootie's only in one group and one department, whereas Jane's in two groups and one department. Okay. Then we thought about and said, well, suppose we were populating new users totally. Could we do that in GAM through a spreadsheet? And could we add all the department information and group information using GAM? Okay. So this is our little spreadsheet here. We're just adding two users. We use GAM to add those users based on the contents of the spreadsheet. In our third to last entry, we are moving these users to a particular OU in Google. In our second to last is where we're adding departments for those users. And in our last command, we are adding groups for those users. So it's saying anything you find in the Zscaler group column, we're going to populate the groups.groups in the custom attributes in Google. Okay? Okay. Then we said, well, it would be easier if we could pull all the users out of Google and put them in a spreadsheet. And this is just showing how to do that here. So we're going to say GAM print users all fields. And those are all our users. We could redirect them to out file. We just put our little redirect sign there, put them in out file. And after we put them in out file, .csv, we would have to add a column to outfile.csv based on the departments and groups field we wanted to use. Okay. So in this example, we took the contents of column W in our Excel spreadsheet, and we used conditional formatting to say if the value in column W is admins. We want to populate the column AG with non-student. If the value is anything else in that column, we want to call it student, okay? And so this is how we use conditional logic in Excel to create a spreadsheet to then populate using GAM, okay? Or to process using GAM. You could probably use Google spreadsheets to do the same kind of thing, to use conditional logic, okay? So that would be how we could process some of this information to get it into Google. And then I thought about it and thought maybe it would be easier. Well, and this is processing the output of the spreadsheet. Okay, then it occurred to me, if I didn't have to deal with spreadsheets, I would have a much better life. I just don't like spreadsheets. So I created a, let me see if I can get the next screen here. Okay, I created a batch file, okay, little DOS bat file. I realize it's kind of old school, that would process my users. Okay, so I'm just going to do clear screen. And if I execute my DOS bat file with no parameters, it gives me a user error, okay? And in this case, I want to take everybody who's in a teachers group and give them a mapping, MCNC.org. So anything in my teachers group, I want to map them in my custom attributes using GAM. I can call them all teachers or something. All right. And it asks, do you want to do this as a production type, or what? Actually, do you want to put these in the department field or the group field? Do you want to do it in production or just as a test? I'm going to do it just as a test, so I do F just to put it in a file. And now if we look at our files, we do type teachers at K12 gaps.mcnc.org. I think it's department. Okay, so if I did it in production and chose the other path through that bat script, it would take maybe a dozen users that I have that are all my teachers in Google, and it would add the department field being all teachers. GAM would just do that, and I wouldn't have to process this using spreadsheets. As you can see, I kind of am using spreadsheets in the back end, but I'm not having to look at them. I mean, they're there, but I'm not really having to look at them. Okay. All right, so that is GAM to do some of the population there. Okay, so now we have our attributes populated, whether we decide to use the Google method of using the GUI, or if we decide to use GAM, GAM with CSV, GAM with command line, we now have some data in our department, in our group schema. So, but in Google, now we have to tell Google to send that stuff to Zscaler. And when we go into our app, SAML app setting for Zscaler, we didn't used to see that these would be selectable, but now we see that they are. So we go into attribute mapping, and we add in the first column department and groups. In our second column, we add department groups. In our third column, department groups. Pretty easy to remember. And of course, we hit save and apply to everybody. Okay? And we saw in Zscaler where we previously added department down towards the bottom, and we added groups. So even though that information wasn't in Google, we put that in Zscaler before, and it didn't hurt anything, but we added that to Zscaler. Okay. So why would you want to use department versus groups? What difference would it make? This table kind of shows the pros and cons. If you have a single membership in a department, so your user is a teacher, they're only in the department teachers, the department teachers will appear in the Zscaler log. You can make filtering decisions if they're in a single department. The groups will never appear in the logs. If you have them in a single group, you can make filtering decisions based on the single group. But if you have membership in multiple departments, Zscaler is only going to process the first department. So say if you have a teacher who's in the administration department and is in the teacher department, it's only going to process the first one, and you would only see the first one in the logs. You're never going to see groups in the logs. And if you have multiple department memberships, it won't make filtering decisions based on multiple department memberships, but it will on multiple group memberships. I know this is very confusing, so I have kind of an example here of what we're talking about. So here we have a user. Our user is 50 Cent, and our user is in 2 departments and in 2 groups. And we have rules created. So our first rule applies to a department, our second to a department, our third to a group, and our fourth to a group. Okay? And let's see, I'm going to go back here and clear out my history here so I can log in as my user, 50 Cent. Okay, and I'm going to go back to Gmail, and hopefully it's cleared me out as... Okay, so now I'm going to be 50 Cent. K12gaps.mcnc.org. Okay, so our user is now logged into Gmail. And our user is going to try going to an alcohol website. And you saw, based on our first rule, that would be allowed. And of course, we still have to go through Zscaler and tell it that we are going to use our 50 Cent credentials. Okay? And because that's allowed in our first rule, we are able to go to our alcohol website. Okay? So our user has been successful in doing that. Beyond alcohol, now they think that they're going to look for drugs. And you saw in our second rule where drugs would be allowed. Okay? But they're not able to go to the drugs website. Okay? And this is because our user is in 2 departments and only the first department is processed. Okay? If they were in a single department, this rule would have worked. Okay? Our user then wants to try and go to a gambling website. They've got a big weekend planned. Trying to go to poker.com. You saw in our third rule where gambling was allowed, so they are able to go to poker.com because they are in that first group. Now they're going to try to go to a profanity website. I had a hard time finding a profanity website, so I looked in one of the school's UIs and filtered on that. So this is a profanity website. As you can see, they are allowed to go to the profanity website. Okay. So the reason why that second rule wasn't hit was because it didn't process the group, or the second department that was in there for our user. Okay. So when we looked at Zscaler a little bit before, we saw how we had auto provisioning set up. What did that mean? Well, with the user's first authentication, the users will start appearing in the authentication users area in Zscaler. And if you looked under the groups or department tab, you would see this stuff starting to get populated because it would be coming over from Google. That's basically auto provisioning, okay? All right, and you see here how in our Zscaler logs, now that we have authorization on and we have those fields populated in Google, instead of seeing default department for our users, we're seeing the actual department that was populated in Google. Okay. So, could you use both Active Directory and SAML at the same time? Well, this shows typically what we'd be doing if you're using Active Directory, because currently, if you have a user inside, you have a user outside, they have to, Zscaler would query Active Directory inside in order for that user to be able to get to the internet. They'd have to be doing an LDAP query, okay? Could this be used, though, with Google and Active Directory. It could. If you were running Microsoft Active Directory inside, you could sync GADS to Google, and you could use GAPS to sync your passwords, or you could use GADS too. And in which case, your accounts in Google would be the same as your accounts in Active Directory. And your users, instead of Zscaler querying inside your Active Directory, would be querying Google. Zscaler would be querying Google. It seemed to be a little bit zippier when I tried this in the lab, but I don't know. It's something to think about. Yeah. So it could kind of fit in with this. Okay, so caveats on this. We did test this in the lab. We tested on your typical platforms. Basically a pass-fail. Did it work? We tried it with a pack file. We tried it with GRE, with your most common platforms and most common browsers. And the thing is, we just can't give it the kind of workout that you would give it in the schools. We talked about how you would need to exclude certain things from authentication and SSL decryption if you had that on. So if you're adding authentication for the first time, you would need to exclude those sites from authentication. Okay. We do keep a list on our website of sites which typically need to be excluded from authentication. Okay. So sometimes you have to exclude these in the pack file, but mostly on site you would need to exclude these sites from authentication. You can do a custom list and add that to your advanced authentication exclusions. You can organize it by the type of site, however you need to do that. But that's something to think about if you're going to add authentication if you haven't been doing that before. Okay. Another caveat is sometimes we see remnants of logins for various users in the browser. And I don't know if y'all have a browser that might look like this. I know this is how my browser looks, and John's sitting here. He's probably got even more stuff in his browser. I might have as many as a dozen users in my browser. But if your users are able to log in with other people's accounts in email, and this stuff is kind of sitting there in the browser, then they can also be surfing on somebody else's dime, okay? And you wouldn't want for that to happen. Whether or not you would be seeing this at your site would typically depend on how you have your browser set up, whether or not cookies are being cleared, whether or not students are being careful about logging out when they leave a machine, if it's a shared machine. You typically wouldn't run into this in a one-on-one scenario, but if it's a shared device, you could run into this situation. It's kind of a situation where it's somewhat difficult to log out users. It's the nature of the beast here. There are at least 3 major LEAs using single sign-on like this. Might be ADFS or Shibboleth, and their users appear to have adapted to the arrangement, but it may not be right for you, so please test. Okay, in a multiple login situation, you can go to ip.zscaler.com, which at least destroys the Zscaler cookie. But if you still have stuff left in there from Google with that multiple user arrangement, you haven't really killed your Google cookies. Okay? And this is just showing how you can log out at ip.zscaler.com. And if you do that, the next time you try and go to a website, Zscaler says, "Who are you?" But you do have to be careful of your cookie being stored. Okay? There's some extensions you can use in Firefox to clear cookies. In my Chrome, I have a Clear Cache Chrome extension, and in my testing, I just go in and hit that, and that clears all my cookies. And then I can log in as somebody else. Okay? So, do we have questions? While folks are thinking about this, if you need help in setting this up, or want to contact John or I offline, you can. one of the things we thought about is, could you add departments and groups using GAM and somehow tie that in with um, PowerShell? You probably could. I haven't been able to get GADS working to use custom stuff to really send that up and associate it with the account in Google. But that's something we could look at doing, depending on how people wanted to deploy this.
Yeah, so I got one message from someone saying, I think this may be a little outside of my reach, a little bit more difficult. That's why we're here. We're here to help you, help you develop the system to be able to synchronize, push this up to your Google Apps or whatever the case may be. So if you need help, let us know. We'll be available to help you get it set up, get the Google Apps Manager set up, the schemas, everything like that, to where all you would have to do is just get a daily CSV or weekly or however often you want to create those accounts up in your Google Apps.
Right. We have deployed this thus far at an actual LEA where they didn't have Active Directory. They're using iPads off-site, and a charter school where they're doing Androids off-site. And well, I guess we did them remotely pretty much. I went to the one charter school on site, but we can pretty much do this remotely if you need assistance. I mean, in the whole departments and groups thing, you don't need to do that. If all you want to do is a yay or nay on the users, and you're sending home a bunch of Chromebooks, you don't need to get into that whole department and group thing.
So I do have one question here from the floor. Anybody asked about separate domains yet? If they are separate email domains, we have tried that, but they are in the same Google Apps for Education instance.
Right. If you need to combine domains, you'd probably be talking to John about that.
Yeah, so if you have two separate Google Apps for Education entities, we still have a couple of those districts that are out there. This will work with both of those types of things.
Well, no, we can only specify one. We can only specify one.
So yeah, if you've got two separate Google Apps for Education instances, so if you have one for your staff and a totally separate Google Apps for Education for your students, this will not work. But if they are the same Google Apps for Education, but you have a staff domain of whatever.com and then a student subdomain of student.whatever.com, it does work. And then we got to follow up. They don't want to combine, could make them trusted. With this, I don't think it's going to work with the trusted. It's going to have to be something that we're going to have to try. We can give it a try and see, but just thinking forward, I'm not seeing how the trusted's going to work with it, because it's still going to want to look at that other Google Apps entity for that. This is coming in from the guest, so guest, if you would, just get with us offline and we'll check it out and test with you. Any other questions? Now, like we said, there's some supporting videos that are out there that are set up to help you with setting up Google Apps Manager. Since it was originally created, some things have changed with regards to setting up Google Apps Manager. If you've got questions, let me know and we'll work with you to get it set up. We've set up GAM with several school districts over the summer. We've got a thank you for continuing to work on the Zscaler authentication measures. Just a reminder, we are recording this, and it will be posted online along with all the other summer webinar series. So if you visit the www.mcnc.org/CNE-webinars, that will take you to our webinar series for this year. So you can go through, watch all the videos again. The presentations are all posted, everything along those lines. And we'll have today's presentation posted there in probably about an hour to an hour and a half today. Got a question. Any districts set up with 2 GREs or 2 Zscaler admins?
We don't know of any. Would the thinking be so that you could do Active Directory on one and host it in another? I suppose. We don't. I mean, if you get up with us offline, I don't know of any reason why you couldn't. Well, let me think about that. Yeah.
It would be an extra load on the equipment.
Yeah,
I don't know
true.
if the NOC.
Yeah. Because you'd have to have the 2 tunnels being, well, 4 tunnels actually, yeah.
It'd be 4 tunnels, 2 primaries, 2 secondaries.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you get up with us offline, we can check into it. No, but your answer is no, we don't currently have anybody doing it.
Yeah, he's asking for the fact of being able to do 1 GRE AD authentication and 1 through SAML. So yeah.
Okay.
No, we don't have that currently set up.
Well, now if they're wanting to use SAML for off-site, there wouldn't be any load in the router, right?
Right.
So we would probably look at that. We wouldn't even have to go through the NOC if that's the question. I mean, if you're wanting to do SAML for offsite, and well, let me think. Well, you still need a different. You need a different Zscaler UI.
Right. So then they'd be managing 2 separate Zscaler. So anytime you added to allow somebody when they're on site, you'd have to turn around and do it off site too.
Yeah. Yeah. So there would be some maintenance involved there.
Yeah, so if you've got any other questions that you don't want to ask today, feel free to drop us a note offline, drop an email or telephone call, whatever the case may be. We'll be more than happy to help you out, try to get that answer for you. This does wrap up today's webinar. We'll be available for a few more minutes online if you have any other questions. If not, thank you all for coming today, and we look forward to hearing and working with you soon.
Thank you.